Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's mighty quiet in this room. You should, if you're the presenter and you want to have some chatter, it's a lot more nervous-making when it's so quiet. Thanks for coming. How many of you were at my presentation last year at BSS? Okay, we have one. Thank you. So if I repeat stories and those kinds of things, you're not going to fault me for that, except for one person. So I'm going to, last year I talked about this framework of thinking of school as a game, not trying to gamify school or bringing in games, but actually acknowledging that there's already a game involved. And that was based on this definition of a game that Jane McGonigal uses, which is that a game is something that has rules, feedback, a goal, and voluntary participation. And we looked at the school and thought about these different things of how do those rules change, or how can they be changed and improved? How can we get more voluntary participation through motivation of the students? What are the goal, and should that goal change, and so on? And we talked a little bit about feedback. Well, today I'm going to focus in on just the feedback aspect of that. And to introduce that, I thought I would use my story from last time. And this is my son. My oldest son was a junior in high school when No Child Left Behind was first rolling out. This was the early 2000s. And he was part of the group that took the leveling test, I guess is the best way to call it. They had just come out with the exams, and his cohort were to take these exams so that they could have a baseline from which to compare. So they weren't supposed to have the same consequences as other people would have. And so he was complaining about having to spend a day and a half taking these exams. All of his friends were complaining about it and so on. And I had picked him up from school one afternoon. We were driving home, and he was complaining about this. And he said, "Dad, why do I have to take these tests anyway?" And I told him the truth, which sometimes is dangerous for a parent. But I told him that they weren't testing him, they were testing his school. That's what the purpose of the No Child Left Behind tests were, is to measure the effectiveness of the school so that in hopes of improving that. Well, I didn't find out until some time later that he and his friends talked about this, and they decided to have a competition to see who could get the lowest score on the exam. And now you have to understand, these are multiple choice exams, typically 4 questions, maybe 5, which means that if you answer randomly, you're still going to be getting 20 to 25%. To get a 0 on the exam, which is what he and several friends tied on, you have to find the correct answer and then make sure that you don't choose it. And so they went to this, and it was, this is about midway through his junior year. So 9 months later, he's registering for his senior year of class. He was supposed to be taking calculus that year, and he finds that he's been registered for remedial mathematics. And so the consequence actually did come up. He had to go have a special meeting with his counselor, who looked at the other data points. Remember, this was one data point, and they had registered for a class on one data point. They looked at the other data points, his performances, his other math classes, including pre-calculus and so on, saw that he was a stellar student in those areas, and of course, he was able to get into his calculus class. But there's all kinds of things wrong with this. The big thing, though, that I want to think about is, what do we use assessments for? The purpose of assessments, in my opinion, is to give us feedback so that we can change the system, change the program, adapt the learning to the individual student's needs, and so on. And in his case, this feedback loop took 9 months to cycle, and it only took 1 data point. And there's all kinds of other things wrong with it, but those are 2 key points, is that we had 1 data point with a 9-month cycle before anything actually changed in his learning experience. So we're going to talk about some of the theory behind feedback loops, some of the evidence that we've been able to find, and see how we can apply that in our own practice in the classrooms, and also for those who are developing new tools, or for those who are choosing tools, interactive learning tools. Hopefully we can have some ideas of what we ought to be looking for based on the research. I represent the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is not obligatory, but it is helpful to set the context of what we try to do at the foundation. It's really focused on helping all people live healthy and productive lives. Now, if you look at how we spend our money, you can see that a huge chunk of that is spent on the global health programs. People aren't living healthy and productive lives because they're dying of malaria or diarrheal disease or HIV or these kinds of things. And so in our global programs, most of the effort is focused on those health. We also have global development, which is focused on primarily on agriculture as well as water and sanitation and some other things. And with the idea that it's hard to live a healthy and productive life if you don't have enough food. Well, once you get those basic needs and Maslow's hierarchy out of the way, the next step up, and where we're focused in the United States, the U.S. program, you can see there on the left, our focus in the U.S. is on improving education. The way we look at this is this intergenerational poverty cycle. What we find is that the best predictor of poverty is your parents' poverty. And if you digest that a little bit further, or if you start to look at it from a prosperity perspective instead of a poverty perspective, you find that educational attainment is the best predictor of prosperity, and prosperity, of course, is the prosperity of the parents is the best predictor of educational attainment. There's some interesting detail that goes into this. For example, among low-income minority students, the greatest predictor of educational attainment is the educational attainment of that child's mother. Father has lower impact than the mother has. So if we can educate girls and women, we are going to have a greater impact on the educational attainment of children and generations following. So this is a multi-generational issue that we have to approach. Now, there are groups that want to attack this problem from the prosperity standpoint through trying to elevate the income levels or supplement the incomes of the families. Our focus is directly on the education side of that equation. Can we educate all students, and can we help them attain great levels of achievement? Now, it's not exclusively on minority or low-income people, but with goals, for example, in K-12 education, our goal is to achieve 80% of students graduating from high school prepared for college. Well, with that goal in mind, we have to look at who's not graduating from high school, who's not prepared for college, and figure out how we can reach those people while improving education for all students in the United States. Gross period. Now, I am a senior technology officer at the Gates Foundation, so my lens is to say, how can I use technology to improve education? And so I think of it from that perspective. And I was at a trade show. I won't tell you which trade show or which vendor was there that had this as their slogan, but I think that it says a lot that they're trying to promote technology that does not change the way you work. I fundamentally, from the studies to the research and my own personal belief, can tell you that if the technology doesn't change the way you work, it's not going to improve educational attainment. So we've got to take a different approach from what these guys were taking. Now let's get into the research then about feedback loops. This is from a book called Visible Learning by John Hattie. I strongly recommend this book to those who have not read it. And by the way, I should have said this at the outset. My blog is called ofthat.com. It was on the opening page. It will be on the closing page. These slides are already posted up there as well as links to a lot of the background resources and so on. So if you need access to all of that, it's all up there and ready to go. So this book, though, is really quite a powerful thing. He goes through and looks at 173 different, actually I got the wrong number, let's see, it's 138 effects on student learning. And it ranges for everything from how much TV do they watch, what is their gender, what is the income level of the family, and so on. And he measures by looking at these meta-studies. So this is the meta-meta study. He takes the studies, they're meta-studies. He took 800 meta-studies that represent over 10,000 actual studies and reduced them to these 173 effects and tells you how they impact student learning. And for each effect, he gives you this little speedometer chart. Now, zero impact, of course, is right here. That means that whatever you did didn't affect anything. You can see some stuff goes into the negatives, television, hours of TV watching being among those, it turns out. And then you have developmental effects. It turns out somewhere around a 0.16 is what a human achieves by simply living. We're natural learners. We naturally develop. If nothing else happens, you will achieve that degree of impact. A student in a conventional classroom achieves about a 0.4 effect size. Now, let me explain what an effect size is. I should back up to that. An effect size is you take a standardized exam, you take the standard deviation on that standardized exam, and then you go through, in this case, the equivalent of 1 year of education on the student. And then you apply that same standardized exam and see what fraction of standard deviation of progress they've achieved from the standard deviation in the original exam, if that makes sense. So these are effect sizes, and by doing that, he's able to take all of these different studies, all of these different results, and bring them onto the same scale. Admittedly, there's some error that happens. There's some nuance to what happens, so you can't take it as just a flat thing, but it is a way of talking about everything in the same context. And the nuance is in there in the discussion of each of these effects. So here we are. It turns out that feedback achieves a roughly 0.7, oh, it's actually the details are here, right? It's a 0.73. So we're up here at a 0.73. It turns out that that is number 10 on his list of top effects. And by the way, a lot of them are in this range below the 0.4, which means that, yeah, you're helping students learn, but it turns out you're doing no better than a conventional classroom is. So applying this technology, these techniques, if they don't get above there, then you're really not making a difference beyond what's done conventionally and has been done for many years and gave us that flat achievement curve on the previous slide. So here's where this turns out to be number 10 on the list, and it's really powerful. And it turns out that there's some nuance to that. If you look, the standard error is a 0.61, which is a medium. I'm not quite sure how that scale works, but it basically tells you how much variation there is among the studies that he looked at, and that's fairly high. That's because the type of feedback makes a big difference. In particular, feedback, the way John Hattie puts it, if the feedback is from the student to the teacher, that has a much greater impact than feedback from the teacher to the student. And that seems a little bit backwards, but if you digest it a little bit further, what it means is notifying the teacher about the student's performance so that the teacher can change their instruction accordingly is more powerful than informing the student of how well they did. Somebody said that summative exams are like a post-mortem. It tells you what happened to the person, but it's too late to make a difference for them. And that's the same case with feedback to the student if it's not done in a timely manner. Likewise, feedback that's in the form of praise. You did a great job. That was good. It actually has a detrimental effect on student performance, strange as that may seem. But according to the studies, in the absence of detail about what it was that they did well and how and what sorts of things they might do to perform better in the future, if it's just empty praise, it actually has a detrimental effect. And there's other studies that have shown that if you praise a student for their effort, then it has a positive effect. If you praise them for their native intelligence, it has a negative effect. Yeah, go ahead.
Anything around whether the feedback needs to come from a human?
Yes, and I'll get to those studies in a second, but the short answer is no, it doesn't have to come from a human. It just has to affect the learning experience. So if the feedback in an automated system changes what happens to the student next, then it has a very positive effect on that. So that's the equivalent of informing the teacher in a timely manner so that the teacher can then adapt their teaching according to the student's needs. So this is then coming from that same book. This is the top 10 student effects, things that affect students. You can see I've highlighted 5 of these top 10 all involve feedback in one way or another. So feedback, as I mentioned, was number 10 on the list. But we have reciprocal teaching. This is where the student teaches back to the parent, or the student, or to the teacher, I should say, or the student teaches another student. So that's obviously a feedback type of a mechanism. if you're not familiar with Piaget, the Piaget programs, number 2, this is understanding the student's developmental state and teaching accordingly. It's not, feedback is a factor in that. It's obviously, there's a lot more to Piaget's programs, but that has a huge impact. Self-reporting grades, hey, guess what? This is reporting my performance to my teacher, right? It's looking at how well I did and grading myself and then reporting that to the teacher. So that's a form of feedback, and that was the number 1 effect size, 1.44. That is huge. That's, if you're learning at a 1.44, you're getting about 3 years of learning in 1 year's calendar time. And so if you can get into those kinds of levels, we are fundamentally transforming how education is working. So, so combining a few of these things together, we start to see some real potential out of the. Look at what a feedback loop is. Essentially, what you have going on here is you have an activity that the student is doing. An activity gets selected sometimes by default if you've got a brand new student and no data on that student. The student performs this learning activity. There's some instrumentation on that learning activity that assesses how well they perform, and that informs the next step in the activity selection. So this is the basic framework of a personalized feedback loop. What can be achieved by doing this? How many of you are familiar with Benjamin Bloom's 2 sigma problem? Heard of? Yeah, okay, we've got one person who's familiar with Bloom's 2 sigma problem. This actually is a monumental study because it's inspired so much work since then. In 1984, Benjamin Bloom reported on the work of some of his grad students in doing one-on-one tutoring with students. The idea was to measure how well could a student progress if resources were no constraint. And so you say, okay, let's get one-to-one student-teacher ratios. We've got a dedicated teacher, and the thing that the reason that this is a feedback system is because humans in a one-to-one situation are constantly, there's a continuous assessment going on of how well the student is understanding and continuous adaptation of the learning experience. In this case, it was grad students teaching the actual students, and they learned at 2 standard deviations better performance. Or if you map that to John Hattie's effect size, the same thing. It's an effect size of 2, right? Roughly 4 times the annual learning rate that you would have in another situation. And this has inspired a tremendous amount of research to say, okay, it's unreasonable to have one-to-one student-teacher ratios in our school, but what can we do that achieves the same sort of thing? Can we apply automation? Can we get cognitive tutors? Can we use mastery learning techniques and so on in that thing? And so we have now, since '84, we've got roughly 25 years of people taking on, Bloom literally called it the problem, and everybody since then has called it Bloom's 2 sigma problem. At Carnegie Mellon University, and they've identified 4 feedback loops. So at the center of your description, you have your student learning data. This is the data that's collected from the learning system, and you need to feed that to 4 different audiences. At the bottom, you're feeding that back to the student himself. So as the student is progressing, they're getting immediate feedback of how they were doing, and the student and the system together adapt the learning experience according to that performance to know what they need to do next. In many ways, last year as I was talking about this, we got into a bit of the motivation. One of the top motivators for people in any activity, not just in education, is a sense of autonomy. So you want to involve the student in choosing their learning activities in order to keep them motivated. But that's what the feedback can do is can help that student have an informed choice. Here's some things that are a good idea to choose. Because if they have an open choice without some information, then they aren't necessarily going to make a choice that helps them in the learning progression. Okay, at the top we have the other pretty conventional feedback loop. This is feeding to the instructor the performance of their students so that the instructor can then adapt teaching according to their needs. On the right-hand side, this is the feedback to instructional designers. So if you've got an online or a digital learning experience, or for that matter, a conventional paper learning experience, if you can feed information back to the designers that created the curriculum, now we have continuous improvement at that level. It's interesting, I've talked to some people at Sumo Publishing, and they are in the business of going to conventional paper book publishers, helping them convert that book into a digital form, and while they're at it, instrumenting the book. And the instrumentation comes in the form of automated, they take just the chapter end quizzes, so or conventional multiple choice type quizzes, and letting the students take those online to self-test, and then feeding that data back, both to the student and to the instructor, but also collecting it in here. And guess what? They find that these venerable textbooks that have been used for some time, very well respected, they're able to go back there and say, hey, did you know that that Chapter 4, Section 5 is broken? The students don't understand that information. They don't pass the quizzes. And, you know, they've been publishing this way for decades, and they don't know that certain portions of their text fail to teach the subject as it's supposed to be done. So even in conventional paper-based instruction, getting feedback in this way can make a huge difference. Now, obviously, we believe in quicker feedback and right to the student, but there's all kinds of opportunities to improve in this. And then the last one, this being Carnegie Mellon, where they are doing research into how people learn. We have this science of learning feedback loop to say, what is the I'm going to bring up a different model. There are a lot of people talking about feedback loops. This is a model that Kurt Van Leen has used, and this is a marvelous paper that he published last year. The references are at the end and also on my blog. I recommend it. He is basically taking a 25-year retrospective on Bloom's Two Sigma problem, and he did a meta-study of several hundred studies of the effectiveness of cognitive tutors. These are intelligent tutoring systems, is the term that he uses. And these are systems that try to replicate the dialogue that a teacher and a student, a tutor, I should say, and a student would have in the process of learning, and to see how well that they would do. Now, there's kind of an assumption that's been going on for some time that human tutors achieve about a 2 sigma improvement based on Bloom's work. And for a long time, a lot of the studies have come out that these computer tutors have achieved about a 1 sigma improvement, which is respectable. Let's face it, that's pretty impressive. It's still not the 2 sigma goal. Okay, and people have been wondering what the difference is between them. Well, it turns out what Van Leen discovered is that human tutors actually achieve about a 1 sigma improvement too. In Bloom's original work, they were also studying mastery-based learning, and the tutors in mastery-based learning, you stay on a subject until you reach a certain threshold of performance on that particular subject. And the tutors were using a 90% correct threshold before they would advance, and the conventional classroom was using an 80% threshold before they advanced. And so that gap between the 1 and 2 sigma improvements seems to be the difference in the threshold. Now, we shouldn't throw that aside and say Bloom's study was flawed. Number one, it's Kurt Van Leen himself says this has inspired some tremendously important studies over time. The other thing is that, hey, guess what? 2 sigma, if you just got a dial on what your threshold of progress is, and you can dial it up slightly and achieve 2 sigma improvements, wow, that's pretty impressive. I can actually control that. So there's a lot to gain from that. But so the interesting thing is that these intelligent tutoring systems are achieving pretty close to the same performance as human tutors are, and that's a big deal. We've made more progress than some people realize that we had. So what he talks about then with these intelligent tutoring systems is that you have kind of 2 nested feedback loops. Around the outside, we have the feedback loop that we were talking about a minute ago, where you take your performance data from the student and you choose what the next activity is going to be. But inside there, you have this nested feedback loop that is within the activity. You've already chosen activity. Now you're feeding back to the student how well they're doing on that particular activity. So on the outside, you may say, okay, I'm going to play an addition game, and so that's the activity selection. Within the game, you're getting constant feedback on how well you're able to, let's say, factor polynomials or understand fractions or something like that. And so these are the nested feedback loops that he talks about. And So we've gotten 15 minutes into our presentation. I figure it's time for recess. For us to play with feedbacks, because feedback loops are around us everywhere. And so everybody needs to shake your hands and relax a little bit. So a little hand shaking. And then I'm going to ask you to put your hands out like this with your elbows slightly bent and touch your fingertips to each other. Okay? So we get so we can touch our fingertips together. Now, the next step is to close your eyes and do the same activity. And I'm going to ask you, those who touched their fingertips the first time without the feedback from your vision, can you raise your hands? Okay, so we have about half of us are able to touch our fingertips the first time without feedback. But, of course, there's a lot more feedback than just the visual feedback, right? Your arm actually, you know what level your arm is or where your fingers are. It's an interesting practice to say, can I align my fingers without the visual? And if you want to play around with this a little bit more, try it with one eye closed, because then you lose your depth perception. And with the lack of depth perception, you tend to go like this as you're going through. So our bodies have built-in feedback loops. The science of feedback actually is within engineering. And so we're going to for a few minutes, we're going to shift from the domain of education and into the domain of engineering. This happens to be my background. My father was a aerospace engineer. He actually taught rocket propulsion, so he was a rocket scientist. And his students would actually go around with T-shirts that say, actually, I am a rocket scientist. So he's a mechanical engineer with specialty in aerospace. I got two brothers who are electrical engineers. My sister's a mechanical engineer. I've got all these engineers around me. I'm a computer scientist, which barely qualifies into that domain, but I can code around them, so that's okay. A domain of mechanical engineering, which is also studying electrical, but it really centers in mechanical engineering, is this concept of control theory. And in control theory, you have a controller. You're going to see this diagram doesn't look too different from the ones I've been using before, and it'll get even better in a minute. You have a reference that goes into that controller. That reference is the desired result or the desired output from the system. So that reference comes into your controller. That controller has a model of how the system works, a mathematical model of the system that you're operating on. And based on its mathematical model, it creates an input that drives the system, and the system then has an output. So let's use an example that most of us are familiar with, the cruise control of your car. And so your reference on your cruise control, I've set my cruise control to 55 miles per hour. I want the car to run at 55 miles per hour. The controller has this mathematical model. It knows that when the accelerator is down, then the speed increases. When the accelerator is roughly neutral, the speed remains stable. When the accelerator is released, then you slow down, right? And so there's for those who are into math, there's an integration going on of the input that gets integrated. So if you're at a high value, then your speed increases. So that's why it's called an accelerator pedal and not a speed pedal, right? Because it sets the acceleration, not the actual speed of the system. So the controller is doing some of that integration to say, I think the speed is this, therefore I should increase or decrease the input to the system, being the engine, the drivetrain, the tires, and so on, and we get a resulting output. So that mathematical model that's within the controller is called the transfer function. And there's this really heavy-duty math that gets into transfer functions. We just need to know that it exists and that it's a description of how the system works. And the degree of accuracy of that transfer function tells you how well this system is going to work. There's a problem with this, though. If the car is always running at sea level, so we know what the air pressure is, on a perfectly flat surface with no turns, and we've got a really good transfer function, we should be able to maintain the speed about what you expected to do. As soon as you start going up and down hills, turning corners, your tires wear, you don't have one pressurized at the same level as the others, and you get a lower grade of gasoline, you're at a higher altitude, all kinds of these external variables change, and yeah, you can make the controller more sophisticated, right? You can start to take in inputs about temperature and altitude and all that kind of stuff and feed all that input into this transfer function and try to get better. But instead of that, it's really a lot easier to put a sensor on your speed. Let's get a speedometer on here and feed feedback back into the controller. Now, the interesting thing is that we have a little bit of perverse vocabulary, at least from the perspective of somebody who's into open education resources like me. And that is that closed is better than open, and negative feedback is better than positive feedback. Okay? This is because engineers speak mathematically and very precisely. A closed feedback loop means that we are taking the output and feeding it back in. So we now have a closed loop, and closed is good. The other thing is that the feedback is negative, because what you do is you take the mathematical difference between what was sensed and what the reference is, and you use that to change the input. Now, if I were to grab this microphone and point it at that speaker, you'd hear this terrible squeal. That's also known as feedback. That's positive feedback. When you get positive feedback, things go out of control. Negative feedback means that you're always talking about the difference between what you sensed and what the result was. And so it's not negative in the sense that you're berating somebody. It's negative in the sense that you're talking about the difference, the mathematical difference between what was detected and what came on the input. So we put that into the car, and it turns out that we don't have to worry as much about all those other parameters, the pressure of the tires and the altitude and the grade of the gasoline and all those kinds of things, because by just sensing the output and adjusting, we still need a transfer function, but it doesn't have to be as sophisticated. And one of the key principles that the engineers have learned over time is that the faster the feedback loop, in other words, the quicker you can get the feedback in to the system, and the more frequent the feedback is detected, the less perfect your transfer function has to be. We're going to get back to that because that has implications on how we go about educating. There we go. What if we close that loop? So we close that loop now through assessments. Now I need to be very careful and talk about what kind of assessments. These are non-summative assessments. Okay? So you can call them formative, you can call them interim, you can call them diagnostic. There are nuanced differences between all those terms, but they are any kind of assessment that happens early enough that it can affect the choice of instruction or the way the instruction is performed. As long as it's in that form, that's the kind of assessment that I'm interested in here. A summative assessment, by design, is supposed to measure. In fact, I was talking to a psychometrician, and I didn't know that this was the case. But if there's any learning that happens in the process of the assessment, then that's considered a flawed assessment, because it does not accurately measure the student's achievement at that particular point in time. That was a scary learning for me, but that's actually one of the principles that the designers of summative assessments use. So be careful about there's a lot to learn from psychometricians, but be careful because they are looking at the world in a particular way that isn't the way that we are necessarily looking at it. So we bring that in there. We compare the feedback against the standards, and we say, what does the student understand? Are they excelling? Are they behind? If they're behind, how does that dictate my choice of the next activity? And remember that even though we've got the student sitting in that box on the right, they're involved in that choice process as well. It's just that if I were more accurate, I'd probably say student learning or student performance or something like that. But the slide gets too cluttered when you do that. So we're doing this feedback to help choose the activities according to what happened. And the faster and more frequently, so the more frequent we perform assessments, and the faster we feed that result back to the student, the less perfect our transfer function has to be. Now, what's a transfer function in this? Well, it's all this stuff about, and there's some great stuff going on. We get this big data effort to start to get recommendation engines, sort of like the way Amazon.com will recommend the book that you might be interested in based on what other people were interested in that had your similar pattern. And we're saying, can we do that in education? Can we recommend learning activities according to what worked for other students that were like you? Students like you performed well on the exam when they did this learning activity. So you do that too. That's great, and I want to improve those transfer functions, but we're not as sensitive to that if we're feeding back frequently. So we can let that science develop and enhance the model, but we can start with the model with the simple practice of assessing frequently and feeding the results back to the student as quickly as possible. Think of this in terms of how I learned mathematics. Each day I had a math assignment. We got a lecture. I took my homework home. I performed my homework. I did all these exercises. I then returned it to the teacher the next day, who graded my assignment and gave it back to me the following day. So the feedback to me on how well I understood that subject comes 2 days after that was the subject of the class. Now, if I did not understand that subject, it's 2 days later and the class has moved on, and hopefully the majority of the class did understand it, and so we just have to move ahead. That feedback loop was cycled in 2 days, and 2 days was too long. On the other hand, most of you have seen, we've got lots of vendors downstairs at the exhibit hall doing this, have seen these systems where the mathematics feedback comes to you immediately, not just at the end of the assignment, but actually at the end of each exercise. Now we've got a feedback loop that's cycling really quickly, and the student can tell immediately, do I understand this or not? Hopefully there are links to supplementary things, and in the worst case scenario, he comes to class the next day and said, teacher, I did not understand this assignment. Please help me on this. And now to add icing to the cake, most of the time my math assignments came back with a check mark that said, you did the assignment. You were present, right? And that actually, that starts right there at that one assignment in the classroom, but it bubbles all the way up into our policy, because what we measure these days is the inputs to the system. Students must spend X number of days in class each year. You must understand math because you spent 180 days per year studying math, right? That's the measure that we use. We're measuring the inputs instead of the outputs from the system. Why? Well, because it turns out that measuring the outputs is expensive, and we're going to get that. So let's take a look then and compare these systems. We have on the top, we have an open loop, and on the bottom, we have a closed loop system. On the open loop, we feed standards in. We have consistent activities for every student. Well, guess what? There's a lot of variability among students. We all knew that, right? They come from different backgrounds. They have different interests. They have different cognition. There's tremendous variability, and we give them a consistent set of activities, and the result is we're going to get variation in the output. No surprise there. Mathematically, it should deliver that because you've got different students, consistent activity. So what we do is we grade their performance. We're going to get variation, so let's assign a grade to their variation so that at least we can see how well they perform. And then what happens is we talk to the students about the grades, and the parents talk to the students about the grades, and all this kind of stuff. And what we hope happens is that student, because they are intelligent also, adapts the learning experience sufficiently that they can perform anyway. And some of the students are capable of doing that, and those are the A students. And some of the students don't have the support or the understanding or the talent or whatever it was necessary to adapt the learning system themselves, and the result is that they are lower performers. Well, in the lower category, then we say, okay, let's take it the other approach. Let's give our feedback and our standards into the thing. Let's personalize the activities, adapt them to the individual student's needs, and the result, we hope, and we've got studies showing this, is at least more consistent achievement. And so has anybody ever dreamed of eliminating the grades in school? Yeah. And has anybody actually seen a school that decided they were going to eliminate grades and the disaster that happened following that? Yeah. Okay, the disaster hasn't happened yet. Hopefully you've got enough feedback going on that you're able to. I mean, that's the key, right? If you just eliminate grades, then things can fall apart. If you can adapt the system to get adaptation to the individual needs, then you can get consistent achievement, and grades will no longer become necessary. You've either mastered the concept or you have yet to master it. That's the only two states that you can reduce it into those two states, and we can get there. So let's take a look then at what are our opportunities. We've talked about most of these. This is more of a summary slide, and it's the only one that has bullets so far. Not bad. So we need our feedback to be faster, more frequent, as I mentioned, and richer. And we'll talk about richness in a minute. It turns out that doing these things are expensive. The reason that we don't assess more frequently, the reason we don't get feedback to the student immediately is because in a traditional instructional model, that's expensive. It takes teacher time to compose the assessment. Well, people say, okay, great, we'll create assessment banks. We'll put the textbook comes with pre-composed exercises and assessments and so on. That's fine. Okay, we eliminated one step, but the teacher still has to administer, score, and report the results of those assessments. So this, being a computer scientist, I look at that and I say, perfect opportunity. I can automate this sort of thing. And of course, I'm not the only one that said this. A lot of people have said this, and that's where we get these adaptive learning systems. And that starts to say why those adaptive learning systems are working as well as they are. And then we start to talk about authenticity. How many have been hearing about deeper learning, right? Everybody wants to get into deeper learning. They want to get into the application of it and so on. Probably the best definition that I've heard of deeper learning is learning that the student is able to apply directly to a particular problem. So this comes from MIT X. It's part of the edX effort. So this is what they call a MOOC, a massive online open course, or massively online. So people like MIT and Stanford and others are accepting hundreds of thousands of students into these massive online courses. Well, if you're going to get that many students into a course, obviously you're not going to assign very much individual teacher time into this. So you've got to have automated ways of them doing things. And so MIT is approaching this by the richness of the exercise. This particular course is on how to build electronic circuits. And the centerpiece of the course is this circuit simulator. So you actually build circuits in there, and these little things are virtual probes. So the student it's the equivalent of having a voltmeter. They can test the voltage, or they can actually hook up a virtual oscilloscope and see the curves and so on. They can measure what's going on as they get into this circuit. And so they have a simulation of the real-world environment in which they are going to experience this. Now, this actually comes out of a lecture. It's telling you what's going on, and then lets the student play with the actual circuit. This exact same experience, though, appears in the quiz later on. It'll give you a partial circuit and say, complete this circuit so it does such and such and so. And then the student actually manipulates it. So this rich activity is instrumented in such a way that the system can tell when the student has achieved the assignment. And what's really great is that they also let you embed these in the forums. So when you're interacting with the other students in the circuits class, you can say, hey, I'm playing around with this circuit that does da-da-da-da, and here it is. And the other students who are on the forum can go manipulate it and tell you what they have in mind for the next steps on it. So it becomes this rich experience becomes a central part of the whole teaching experience of circuits. And you can imagine a composition system that would help in the teaching of English writing. You can imagine a physics simulation for the teaching of physics. Obviously, I gravitate towards the STEM side, but this stuff applies so well in the humanities as well. In fact, the Open Learning Initiative that I mentioned before, they teach a philosophy class using their online system. You say, wait, how do you use an online feedback-based computer response system to teach philosophy? It's a very human type of a thing. And it turns out what they do, it's a blended learning mode, right? And what the online feedback-based system does is it ensures that the students have the same basis before they arrive in class. They understand what the previous philosophers have thought. They understand some of the pros and cons of different ideas and so on with this feedback and this assessment going on. Then they arrive in class in this blended environment on a level field. Some may spend a lot more time preparing than others because of their previous background, but they're ready for a really rich in-classroom discussion of philosophy. So they've been able to find a way of blending the online to make sure that you've got the fundamentals in place, and then the classroom experience that, as far as I'm concerned, you can't teach philosophy any other way, right? In music, it's the same idea, right? You've got the ensemble that meets together in class, and you sing or you play your instruments together, but you can learn your music theory online and get those fundamentals in place before you show up there. So just to wrap up, here are some of the initiatives that I mentioned with links to them. I actually forgot to mention Khan Academy and NROC Math. Both of those are good examples of these mathematics feedback systems that I've been talking about that's on there. Most people are familiar with Khan because of the video collection that he has. What they don't realize is there's a whole set of exercises with immediate feedback on your performance that are also there, fully open to whoever wants to use them. And the great thing about Khan is that any student can choose to use it regardless of which textbook or which teacher or what classroom they're in. They can simply go to Khan Academy for assistance, and it's helped a lot of kids. NROC Math is a really rich, fully integrated curriculum with exercises, video lectures, and so on that's being piloted in a bunch of schools at the 8th, 9th, 10th grade mathematics level of algebra, and they're getting tremendous results from students who have never succeeded in math previously. Hewlett Foundation recently sponsored this competition to see who could replicate human scoring of essays. Now, I've got some personal feelings on this. That I think that humans are critical to the teaching of writing, but it's interesting to see where you can push the envelope in terms of the automated scoring. The key thing here is that automated scoring is doing a pretty good job of telling you how well structured your essay is, how well you're doing your grammar, how well you're doing all these kinds of things. What it cannot tell is what is the quality of your argument, how are your facts actually factual or fallacious. So they can't tell the truth of the argument, those kinds of things. But if you can get the mechanics out of the way for the students so that they're engaging with the teacher at that level, and then a lot of people are looking at peer grading, right? Remember that really high on that list of John Hattie's impacts is reporting your own grades. Well, it turns out that grading other people's work has similar impact because it starts getting you thinking about this from the standpoint of what's expected. And so a lot of the MOOCs are looking at peer grading systems when you have things that just require human examination. And maybe you'll have 2 or 3 peers grade the thing and then get a correlation among their grades so that you know that somebody's not messing with the system and so on. They're commercial products. Most people are familiar with Alex and Newton. Live Mocha is really cool. It pairs language learners. So an English speaker who's learning Spanish gets paired up with a Spanish speaker learning English, and they can grade each other's performance as they're learning it and get immediate feedback at scale that's similar to what you might achieve with one-to-one tutoring in a domain that automated scoring simply doesn't work. And so I'd like that particularly. So just to summarize, quality feedback results in standard deviation improvements over conventional learning. To close that feedback loop, you really have to change the learning experience from what it's been done before, and in particular, you've got to change it based on what's coming in. Frequent and fast feedback can compensate for less sophisticated transfer functions, so we don't have to wait for the cognitive science and the recommendation engines and the big data people to catch up with that, so we can proceed forward with what's already here. I like that research. I'm following it closely, but it's not required. We don't have to wait for it. Getting the student involved in the feedback loop, in the choice of activities, starts to get us into the non-cognitive, emotional, motivational pieces of the equation, which are just as important as the cognitive, factual part of it. And finally, just be cautious about what we learn from psychometricians. They've got a lot to contribute, but they have a worldview that's just enough different from what ours is that you have to take their recommendations with caution. So as I go to Q&A, hopefully I've been able to stimulate a few questions. Here are some of the references that I used. And like I said, if you go to my blog on ofthat.com, I just, right before this session, posted the slides and links to a lot of this background information. So, questions? Yes, right here.
If you do the self-reporting grade with such a high effect size, do we want to cut that out with an automated feedback loop? And it's something we deal with a lot in our system. Teachers complain that the student needs to report their own progress because we haven't closed that in a totally automated way. But I'm just curious if you have any comments on that.
I don't have any research-based background. In fact, the first thing I would do is go read that section in Hattie's book. And since I've read the book, but there's 130 some effects. I don't remember the details on that particular one, even though it was number one. But I would say though that yes, you can start to deploy things without automation. It seems to me that you should be able to deploy things without automation through student self-reporting and start to get things. It correlates with something else, that the Gates Foundation measures of effective teaching project learned. And so for those who aren't aware, the measures of effective teaching is the first attempt to actually categorize what it does, what makes an effective teacher on a quantitative basis. And so they put students in a standardized exam at the beginning and the end of the year, and they videotaped the classrooms, and then had people say which of these hypothesized techniques the teacher was using, and then correlated them with student performance. But one of the other things that they did is they had the students grade. They basically sent a questionnaire to the students and had the students evaluate their teachers. Now, if you say, is your student grader bad, that doesn't help a whole lot. On the other hand, if you ask them detailed questions, my teacher does this, my teacher does this, my teacher does this, they have some quizzes where the student's evaluation of the teacher correlates extremely well with how well the students in the class perform, and it comes out with detail of what techniques the teacher could do to improve their performance or what it is that they're doing that makes it happen. So that whole world is some stuff that we can really get into without having to deploy one-to-one computing and that kind of stuff. That helps. Yes?
I appreciate the engineering analogy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested in projects around transposing models across where you believe the limitations
of that metaphor is.
What assumptions is it making that we have to
Yeah, good question. I haven't thought of it that way, so give me a second. Short answer is that I wouldn't believe the model if we weren't getting some of the research that I also provided showing that this does work. So yeah, you can't transpose without you can get a hypothesis that way, but you better find some evidence afterwards, and we are getting evidence on that. I would say the limitations are, the first one, I probably the most important one, is that the transfer function in a mechanical system is a very specific mathematical. You actually have to write out in the math. We can't model human behavior that way, and mathematically we can get some probabilities. That's what the recommendation engines and so on are trying to do. But I think drawing too much into that whole part of the control theory, which if I were to take a class in control theory, we'd spend most of the semester on that. That stuff doesn't apply as much as simply doing the negative feedback, comparing the results against what you wanted to achieve, and using that in a general way to recommend the next exercise, or for that matter, just deciding, if you can be pretty effective with just a binary output. Do I advance or do I stay on the same subject? You can get some pretty impressive results with that simple of an output alone. And getting too much in, I think that's probably the biggest part of the metaphor, but I'd have to think about it a little bit more. Maybe there are others too. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Now, are you talking about kind of the learning styles research, or more of the? I know that there's UDL also approaches understanding student disabilities and addressing those as well. All of these. So the research into learning styles seems very promising, but it's gotten kind of mediocre results as they've done the studies. The interesting thing that did pop out of that, because the learning styles tends to give options. In some of the studies, the students have a choice among options of what their modality is going to be. When that choice is delivered to the student, you get a motivational benefit, which is different from the cognitive benefit, but really important. So there's some stuff there. I quite honestly, I think the adapting to disabilities, it's just intuitively obvious that we should do that. And one of the things, actually a project that I just got the email earlier today, the grant agreement is out. I'm involved in the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative, which is marking up learning resources according to the subject being taught, the grade level, and those kinds of things. We're going to be enhancing that with disability information. so that the teacher would be able to go out there and say, I need something that can teach a person with dyslexia some exercises on reading ability or something like that, and you're going to be able to actually have something, or for that matter, something that can help a person with dyslexia factor polynomials. I don't know if that disability affects polynomial factoring, but we're going to be able to mark up content that way if that were actually a factor. So we're certainly putting effort into helping that problem. I suspect that there probably is research, but I'm not familiar with the research that shows how well this kind of adaptation would work for it. It's intuitively, it totally makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, so I have somebody who thinks that they can achieve 10x improvement in student performance. That's not 10 sigmas. Yeah, I have to. It's two different domains, but he does believe that they can go well past 2 sigma in this. And maybe if I have time, I'll tell you some of the reasons why he believes that. But in terms of the quality of the feedback, the starting point I would recommend for looking at is the section on feedback in Hattie's book. And he references, I haven't read it yet, so I can't endorse it personally, but he references a paper that he and a couple others had written about a year before. It goes into a lot of detail about the quality and the different types of feedback. But that 2.5-page section in his book, he talks about some of the things I was saying earlier about how empty praise, just praising them without detail, is a negative impact, how specific understanding of needs obviously is important, the timeliness of the feedback, the kinds of things. So there's a domain of research, and those are a couple starting points that you can get, and then the underlying papers below that would be valuable. So.
I think you said this at the beginning, but he also says the greatest impact feedback is for the students to feedback to the teachers.
Yes. Yeah.
We miss that a lot, I think. We overlook that.
And it's, all the teacher has to do is invite it, right? Yeah. Although let's digest that slightly. The feedback to the teacher in Hattie's definition includes the student performance. So it's not only the student expressing to the teacher what they understand and what they don't understand. That's a key part of it. But it's also the student's performance being measured and the teacher taking a look at the measure and adjusting the teaching accordingly. So assessments are still part of that feedback process. Yeah.
Is that age appropriate or differentiating for age? Adult learner?
Yeah. There are studies on that. I'm not deep enough into it to be able to give you any conclusions from it. But yeah, studies have been done in that direction. So it's not all I can say for me. Yeah, the PhD stuff would get into that, I think.
To what extent is this notion that feedback to the teacher is one of the more important elements that the automation of grades at this point as far as technical collapse, the quality of what the teacher thinks the teachers go back and auto grading because they don't see the students, they can't get into the student's head. That sort of loss of the integration
The transfer function, yeah.
where if I'm going to attune myself as a teacher to what I believe is getting my students stuff, I have to have understanding about their thinking to make those adjustments.
Yeah.
That's where machine grading
The work in that area is mostly around teacher dashboards. How well can we inform the teacher about their students' performance? And, you get into this area of strategic interventions. How do you identify the teacher? Which student needs their attention right now, and what particular attention, and so on. I think we're out of time. And actually, when were we supposed to go to? Maybe we're over time. Are we over time? Yeah. We're way over time. Sorry. Thank you very much.
And parents will just look at the percentile of their student and feel good or bad. So